If you're a new player to Rise of Kingdoms and you're wondering whether or not Minamoto is worth it, the answer is a slam dunk yes. And even experienced players should reconsider using Minamoto based on the recent buff that he got in the museum. So stick around in this video for everything you need to know about Minamoto. Whether you're an endgame player figuring out where he belongs in your open field marches, or an early game player trying to decide if he's worth the money, this video has the answer for you. Hello, my friends, and welcome back. I'm Chisgule Gaming, and I can't believe that I'm talking about Minamoto in 2023 as being a meta commander in Rise of Kingdoms, and yet here we are. There are situations where he is simply one of the best cavalry commanders in the game that you can use. So in this video, I'm going to break it down. Why is it that Minamoto is an amazing commander in 2023 and beyond? Who should max Minamoto? What are the best talents? What are the best pairings? All the things you need to know about using this commander. And if you find this sort of information to be valuable, consider throwing a like on the video to honor my commitment to your getting the best information possible about commanders in the game, and subscribe to the channel for daily Rise of Kingdoms videos. Let's just start this off with, why is Minamoto an amazing commander, and why is he suddenly someone that we're talking about all over again? And the reason that we're talking about Minamoto in 2023 as a commander that is extremely relevant is because of this building over here. It's called the Museum. Now, if you're an early game player, you don't have this yet, but when you get to KVK Season 4 and beyond, that's Kingdom versus Kingdom, you get access to this building called the Museum, where you can apply buffs to different commanders. And the buff for Minamoto is insane. You don't have to have the commander expertise to be able to apply this buff on top of what the commander already does. So your eyes do not deceive you. When you get to the end game in Rise of Kingdoms, you can add 30% defense and 30% attack to your Minamoto, and that is absolutely insane. This is the difference between him being fine and being really strong, and 30% of stats for both defense and attack is way more influential than I honestly thought it would be. Now, if you're in the early game and you're like, Chisgule, I don't even know what KVK is yet, then you're still a long way away from getting to this point where the Museum is available. But Minamoto is still really great in the early game leading up to this point. And as a VIP commander, he's actually one of the cheapest commanders in the game to go in expertise. And although you have to unlock him from VIP, and you can only use sculptures from VIP to improve your Minamoto, at under $200 for an expertise legendary, that also is really good in the end game, this is a bargain compared to most other commanders in Rise of Kingdoms, which you'll either have to earn over time fully free to play, or you can spend to get sculptures occasionally from different events in the game, like a recharge event or a Writer of History bundle. But Minamoto turns out to be really cheap compared to all of his other counterparts. So if we jump back to the skills on Minamoto, we can talk about why he's good, but I first want to mention that we did some testing in some previous live streams with endgame commanders, and the best open field march for cavalry in the endgame at the time of this recording is the commanders Nevsky and Joan. And if you're like, bro, I'm new to the game and I don't see any of these commanders, that's because commanders are released over time in Rise of Kingdoms. You'll gain access to them eventually, and a large number of commanders are only available in the endgame, and if you don't see them yet, you're not there. With that said, the combination of Nevsky with Joan Prime is the best cavalry combo in the game right now, and Nevsky with Minamoto was beating this combo in duels. Now, look, that doesn't mean that Joan isn't the better commander for a big open field battle. Joan Prime is, in my opinion, better than the Minamoto. But my point is the fact that it could even punch so hard that it is winning in duels is really impressive. Now, the thing that Minamoto does so well is that he's got really good single target damage and a really killer debuff. And this debuff on the 4th skill is what new players to the game really underestimate. And old players in the game often don't even know how to look at this correctly to evaluate just how good debuffs are. So let's start by just talking about this active skill. This is doing 1400 damage factor and then has the chance of doing a damage over time. When you factor in that damage over time, it ends up being an average of 2300 total damage factor, which is really good. Now look, the end game, you're going to have commanders that do that and more, which is insane. But this is why they added the museum buffs. The extra 60% of stats on Minamoto from the museum buff that I showed you earlier is pretty freaking insane. So he's got really good damage factor, and it's all single target. And although, obviously, I prefer area of effect damage for big open field fights, the single target damage is really good if you're swarming something, like a flag or a fort or a rally, which makes Minamoto actually really good even for endgame players. But the real kicker to his kit is right over here. It's this skill Warlord, which people don't know how to look at. So let me explain this in a way that brings it back to a static number. Like if I could give you one number that represents the value of this effect, here's how we get to that. You see, Warlord has a 10% chance to make the target take 30% more all damage for the next 3 seconds. This is very powerful because everything hitting that target gets the benefit. So when you are swarming a flag or a fort, there's 12 marches in total that should be swarming. That makes a debuff like this really powerful. You multiply the benefit times the number of marches that are hitting. But if we go back to just like the sort of what I refer to as unit economics, like what does this give you at a per unit level just for Minamoto? You take that benefit over time, which is 30% all damage times the 3 seconds. It's like 90% of cumulative benefit. Divide by time. That's 5 seconds cooldown between how often this effect can trigger, and on average, 10 seconds for it to trigger. So you take that, that's 15 seconds total. 90 cumulative benefit, divide by the 15, you're looking at, on average, 6% all damage. Which you might think like, bro, on average, 6% all damage is not that big a deal. Okay, but remember, multiply that by 12 for the number of marches swarming a flag, and all of a sudden you're looking at like 72% of all damage, which suddenly sounds really good. And what's more is that, remember, all damage is worth like twice as much as a stat like health is worth. So this is actually worth the strange equivalent of like 144% health. I know that's not how that works at all, but I'm trying to illustrate to you how insane this debuff is and how good debuffs are in general. And this is why Minamoto is so effing good, okay? So debuffs are underrated. People don't know how to look at those abilities and understand why they're so strong, which is why I tried to break it down for you. And there's going to be a bunch of people who say in the comments probably that I did the math wrong, but I don't think I did. I think that's accurate, and it's a fine way of looking at it, even though I understand that all damage is not health. It doesn't work that way. You just need something to try to bring it back to a measure that people do understand, and they understand raw stats. So if we summarize all of this together, you've got a commander with killer single target damage, an amazing debuff that works really well when you're swarming stuff, or even if you're just bringing 5 marches to the open field, and he's cheap compared to other commanders, and with his museum buff, he's relevant in the end game. This makes Minamoto, hands down, one of the best investments in Rise of Kingdoms. And by the way, he's also the best commander in the game for rallying barb forts, if you wanted PvE value as well. Although I am hyping him up a lot, let's ground in reality where Minamoto ranks in the end game. And this video would be way too long if I go in depth on each of these commanders. I'll simply say, I think Nevsky is the #1 cavalry commander. Joan Prime will be the #2 cavalry commander. William will be the #3 legendary cavalry commander. And then XY is the #4 legendary cavalry commander in the end game. At #5 or 6, we've got 2 commanders, and I don't know where exactly they rank, but that's Minamoto and Chandragupta I would put together as a similar ranking. And then below that, I would put Saladin and Bert, probably as a similar-ish ranking as well. And maybe I'm undervaluing Bert, quite frankly. So all that to say, wait a minute, Chisgule, why is Minamoto so low on your list compared to all the other cavalry commanders, but you're saying he's such a good investment? The reason is very simple. you can expertise Minamoto with a relatively small amount of money and then work on other commanders. If you're new to the end game, you have way too many projects, way too many commanders to work on. So being able to just lock in a commander that you got from the early game who was amazing in the early game and then serves you in the late game is just super high value. So if you're going to spend on Minamoto, and look, this is not financial advice. I'm not a financial advisor. You have to consider your situation for spending in mobile games. But if you are going to spend, dropping the $200, it's slightly less than that, as early as possible is the way to go. And if you are going to do this incrementally on your Minamoto, then the way to do this would be to try to unlock the first 2 skills and max them, then unlock the last 2 skills and hope that everything lands on this 4th skill. So you're trying to get a 5-5-1-5 as you work on buying his bundle over time, because I understand that it's expensive and, you know, not everyone can just drop $200 all at once when they're playing a mobile game. Now, that said, if you are already in the end game, then probably Minamoto is a commander that you don't go back and purchase unless you just got there and you're a big spender. And the reason that I'm saying that is that, you know, if you're already in the end game, you know, you start to look at other commanders. You may already have a bunch of cavalry commanders, and I generally don't recommend investing in a commander that's like number 4 or number 5 or number 6 in the best list of commanders for their type. In fact, what I often recommend is that you only invest in commanders that are new when they're released, and you invest in them when they're like the number 1 commander or the number 2 best commander for that unit type. Because if you're spending money and investing sculptures in a commander that's like number 4 in the list or number 6 in the list for that unit type, that means they're going to be replaced sooner than all the other ones. And you only want to make investments in this game, in my opinion, in things that are going to last you years and years and years. You want to pick a commander that's new and hot and will last you, again, for multiple years at the time of your investment. You don't want to pick a commander that's going to be only useful for a short window and then drop off in utility. Now, Minamoto is sort of unique in the fact that he's one of the best Barb Fort rallies, but you can use other commanders to rally Barb Forts, and a lot of people just use Nevsky, and it's really, really good for that. Now, since we're talking about commanders, let's talk about the pairings. And if you're in the early game, I recommend the following pairings. Minamoto with Baibars in the early game is kind of nutty. Baibars is easy to work on because he's epic, and his area of effect damage does not diminish based on the number of targets that he's hitting. You'll notice that other commanders have their area of effect damage diminish based on hitting more targets, like Isong. Well, Baibars doesn't do that, so he scales really, really nicely. So Mina Baibars is a great early game combo. Of course, Minamoto with CC is a great early game combo. Very strong. And one thing that really triggers me is when people run CC as the primary with Mina as the secondary. And this is dumb. Even if you're going to hit Barb Forts, this is really dumb. The reason that I'm saying that is that although you get to the Barb Fort faster, because the talent tree on Double C doesn't have the skill tree or really a good tree here. And the mobility tree is, you know, fine if you're going to run around a Mightiest Governor, I guess, and like, you know, smash gatherers. But because you do so much less damage from the mobility tree, you actually end up killing the Barb Fort so much slower that you're better off just using the Minamoto as the primary, arriving to the fort slower, but killing it faster and getting a better trade. So anytime I see a CC primary for a Barb Fort rally, it's like, bro, you're like kind of doing it wrong. Even if you're going to use Ethelflaed with CC, it should be Ethelflaed as the primary. So there's no world in which you rally Barb Forts with the CC primary. Sorry, I just had to get that off my chest, man. It triggers me. From there, open field, if you had Minamoto and Mehmed as a 5-5-1-1 would be good enough in the open field in the early game. I think that's also a really great combo. Now, in the late game, you're looking at the following combos as being the very best. Either Nevsky primary with Minamoto, Joan Prime as the primary with Minamoto, or XY paired with Minamoto. All of those are really, really good. If you wanted to pair with William, then you do Minamoto primary, William secondary. You'll have to take my word for it that William does not make for a good primary. He needs you to generate more rage, and he doesn't have that in his talents. I tried. I took him to 60. It was bad. Mina primary, William secondary is the way to run that. And lastly, if you're just getting to Season of Conquest, it would honestly be reasonable to run Minamoto with Mehmed. And the crazy thing about Mehmed is that he also has a museum buff that's really, really strong. So lots of really good combos in the end game. In fact, you may have others for Minamoto. Definitely drop a comment down below with any other cavalry combos you would recommend with Minamoto in the end game. But now that we've covered the pairings and why he's good, and even how to work on him incrementally, let's talk about the talents that maximize the effectiveness of your Minamoto. And if you're talking about PvE, this is like rallying barbarian forts, then this is a really good build. There is another variant of this build where instead of going to the right of the tree, you go to the left side of the tree and you pick up Undying Fury. I think that would also be a fine choice. If you're working on this incrementally and you're rallying barb forts, start with Insight and also getting Mighty Force and Killer Instinct, then go over to Rejuvenate, then fill out the rest of this tree going for Feral Nature, and lastly go for the Cavalry March Speed up top over here. If you're using Minamoto for battling barbarians, and I wouldn't recommend that, by the way, I think that you should have him talented for doing barb forts because he's the best primary. But if you're going to do barb forts and barbs with him, I guess, then this is the way you'd want to run the build, going all the way down to Curing Chant, also getting Rejuvenate, and then all the way up over here, Undying Fury. If you're doing this incrementally, start with Insight, then get Rejuvenate, then fill out the rest of the tree to Curing Chant, and lastly get Undying Fury. If you wanted to fight in the open field, and you find that most of your skirmishes are very short, then this is the build that I would recommend that you use. Now, personally, I would say that like most skirmishes, you should try to stay in the fight longer than just like 10 seconds. And Rallying Cry ends up being not all that great for the way that end game fights are actually run. So I'll have another build that I'll present to you in just a second. But before I go there, I do just want to mention how this latent power talent works. I've covered this in depth in other videos, but this only affects damage over time. Now, Minamoto does damage over time in his active skill. Remember, a big part of his damage occurs over 2 seconds. That's damage over time. Latent power only influences the damage over time portion of that effect. So you can put the 3 points over here, and I think that's fine, especially if you have a secondary commander that's also doing good damage over time effects. But the build I would prefer for Minamoto, although I don't have him on him, have that on him currently, is the same build I'm using on my Nevsky. I can show it to you here. This, I think, is a better build, okay? This is better because it gets more rage. Minamoto wants that rage to apply his really great active skill more frequently. I really like this build for the open field. That would be my recommendation. I wouldn't leave home without Halberd. It's very, very strong. Ideally, you'd have like one more talent point to peel off. Minamoto has basically the same trees as Nevsky, except instead of versatility, he's got peacekeeping. So there is an opportunity to get a little bit of march speed over here on Minamoto that you can't get on Nevsky. But I wouldn't trade the rage. I wouldn't trade the skill damage taken reduction to try to get the 1 point for the march speed. It's just not worth it. I can show you that again on the Minamoto and how we did that over here. In this talent tree, we went and we took that 1 point. Okay, I don't think you need to do that in the build I would prefer, which is the one I just showed you that I'm using on Nevsky. Honestly, I'm kind of surprised that in 2023, I can say with a straight face that Minamoto is actually one of the best cavalry commanders to swarm with in the game, and that I will probably be bringing him in to my sort of special teams, if you will, for swarming garrisons, because the debuff is just that damn good, and all of his damage is single target, which is exactly what you want if you're trying to take down a fort or a flag. So yeah, Minamoto, he works in the end game, and you unlock his double relic museum buff, and you freaking slap, man. So he's good in the early game, good in the late game, and he's cheap compared to pretty much every other legendary, unless you want to work on them free to play. And look, there's plenty of commanders you can work on that are free to play, that are really, really strong. But if you want to see more details about Minamoto, and specifically the live stream where we were testing him and going, wow, he's actually really good, I'll have a card in the end screen for that in just a second.